I'll show you now the sound editor, which is the in-depth menu editing interface for setting up synth sounds and dealing with samples in a slightly more complicated way as well. So I'll make a brand new synth track. So holding down Shift, just like holding down Shift and pressing Kit made a brand new kit, holding down Shift and pressing Synth makes a brand new synth. And it is just a basic square wave one by default, and we're going to turn it into an actual sound. So going into the menu is done by pressing down on the select knob. The menu, kind of like the file browser that you saw before, it's sort of a hierarchical structure, and you can scroll through all the options in the current level by turning the select knob. So this is the root level menu. You can set up your individual oscillators as oscillator 1 and 2. So all the synth sounds have up to 2 oscillators. I'll show you the FM ones later. They get 2 modulators as well as 2 carriers. I'll start going through some of the options and showing you what they do. So the default synth that is being created is just one square wave oscillator. If we go into oscillator 1, we can see all its options. If we go into type for it, we see that it's set to square wave. We can change it. Saw, sine, triangle, and sample, which would allow us to load a WAV file from the SD card to use as that actual oscillator source. I might show you that one a little bit later on. Let's go back to square wave for now, jump out of that option, and there are a few other options for oscillator 1. There's pulse width, and transpose and scent, so you can set the transpose separately if you have multiple oscillators going on, and volume as well for that oscillator. Let's jump out of oscillator 1. We can go and do some more things to it, like we can apply some noise as well. So this is just a basic white noise source, which can happen along with the oscillator. That'll sound a little bit better once we've got a filter going as well. Jump out of noise. Go on to low pass filter. So you can access the low pass filter with the gold knobs here. That's sort of a shortcut way to do it. But the menu really gives you access to all the parameters. So going into the low pass filter submenu, frequency, you can really go in and just set that to whatever you like. I'll show you in a minute how to patch an envelope to the filter frequency. For now, let's set up an envelope just for the synth sound. Again, you can actually access the attack and release times for an envelope, for the main envelope, envelope 1 that I just went into, which is the amplitude envelope. You can do that just with the 2 gold knobs here. But you can also, in the menu here, you can also affect the sustain and the decay time. I'm going to switch that noise back off because it doesn't sound that great. Going through some more of the options, there's also a high pass filter, works much as you'd expect. That can be on at the same time as the low pass filter, so you can get some sort of band pass type effects there. I was also going to show you for the low pass filter, you can change the mode between 12 dB per octave and 24 dB per octave. Oops. There's an envelope 2 as well as envelope 1. That is patched to nothing by default, but you can patch it to anything you like. I'll show you patching in just a moment. LFOs as well can be set up. There's 2, LFO 1 and 2. LFO 1 is global to the entire synth sound, so it doesn't reset when you do a new note or anything, and the same LFO applies to all voices. LFO 2 applies per voice and is re-triggered each time there's a note on. Within the LFO menu, there's the type of wave, sine, triangle, square, saw, etc. I'll show you an example in a moment where the LFO is actually controlling something. Oh, and I was also going to show you the other options. There's rate and tempo syncing as well. Voice options. There's another sub menu we can go into, so you can select whether you want polyphonic or not. Go into poly, switched on by default. If you switch it off, the Deluge does actually still allow you to play multiple voices at once if you choose to, but it just means that previously playing notes, when a new one starts, if a previous one is releasing, it stops it instantly, so you can really get those sort of monophonic bass sounds. So you see it. As soon as the new note started, it cut the previous tail short, whereas if that new note hadn't started, the old one does still ring. But if I really wanted to, I could actually play a chord still. It won't stop you from doing that. I'll go back into the menu. More voice options, unison detune. You can switch that on. By default, with this new synth, it's off, just one voice, but you can turn that up all the way to 8. If you jump out of that, you can also change the amount of detune. Portamento, this is a good one. Arpeggiator. So I'm now in the arpeggiator submenu. It's off by default. I've gone to its mode. You can switch it to the up mode. Also has a down mode and a both mode. At the moment it's only doing 1 octave, so they'd sound mostly the same. If we jump out of that one, we can go and change the number of octaves. Well, it was set to 2, which is 2 octaves, including the bottom one. Set it to 3, 4, go all the way out to 8. Just too high to hear, I think. It also has options for gate, which is how long each of the arpeggiated notes is switched on for the time division that you are arpeggiating to, which you can also set under sync. It's going to arpeggiate to 16th notes by default, but you can change that to whatever you like. And of course, you can, if we hear that actually in a sequence, you'll hear that. You'll hear that arpeggiator happening in time to the tempo. If I don't have a beat going at the moment, if I switch the metronome on, you hear that it is synchronized. I'm going to switch the arpeggiator back off for now. I'm going to switch the portamento off as well. So that I can show you some more features. I'm going to show you patching now using using a modulation source such as an envelope to affect a parameter. So this can be done very flexibly. Any modulation source can be used for almost any of the parameters. If you go into, I'm going to show you the basic example, low pass filter frequency. So again, we can control that just with the gold knob quickly, set the value to whatever we want. If I press down on the knob again while I'm viewing this number, it takes me into a further menu where I can select what modulation source I want to affect that parameter. So let's use envelope 2 to control the low pass filter frequency. If I go in there, then I can select how much I want it to affect the low pass filter frequency. So this is with nothing at all. Start turning that up a little bit. Turn it up a lot. Too much. Hit the back button to go back. We can have multiple modulation sources affecting a parameter at the same time. So as well as envelope 2, we could also say have LFO 1 going to the low pass filter frequency. I think I set it to a saw wave before, which probably actually isn't ideal for an LFO. That's kind of interesting sound. So, and now we're back in the menu where we had selected to go into frequency to set its value and patch things to it. You see now it has a dot next to it indicating that there is patching on that parameter. You could also do the same for resonance or any number of different parameters. And of course, now that we have envelope 2 patched to something, we can go and change its attack and release settings as well. So that's envelope 2 going to the low pass filter frequency. Changing the attack time. It's sort of chopping around there because again I had that LFO going to the filter frequency as well, and I stupidly set that to a saw wave, so let's make that sine wave. Much smoother. A number of effects are included. I briefly showed you some things like the bit crushing and sample rate reduction before. There's also a full range of modulation effects. So by default that's switched off, but you can also switch that on to flanger. It's kind of an extreme setting. You have control over the rate and the feedback for the flanger. Just turn the filter frequency up a bit there so you can actually hear what's going on. As well as flanger, there's chorus, which has the same rate as the flanger. I'll just make that something a bit more usable for chorus, which usually has a slightly faster rate than a flanger. And phaser. Oops. Turn that rate back down. There's a depth control for the phaser as well. And for chorus. Chorus has depth and offset controls as well. Now turn modulation effects back off. EQ, you saw that before. This is the way to do it in the menu. You saw it being done with the gold knobs. In there's just bass and treble controls, and also the actual bass and treble frequencies can be altered. So for instance, if I turn up the treble amount here, it's got quite a bit more trebly. Jump out, you can actually change the treble frequency. So making it a bit lower gets a bit more into that treble boost, or if you make it higher, it's really only boosting that very high treble that you probably almost can't hear. Oh, back to the middle. I will switch that triple boost back off. Delay, again you saw before, but here is how you set it up in the menu. This gives you one extra option, which is the tempo syncing, which you can sync to whatever time interval you want, or you can switch it off completely. In which case when the tempo changes, the delay speed will not change. Reverb, again you can actually access with a gold knob function as well. Back to the reverb, switch on some reverb. And there are also options for room size, dampening, stereo width, panning, and even its own sidechain compressor. I haven't even covered sidechain compression yet. I'll show you in a moment how to apply that to a more normal synth track, but you can even have the delay tails having their own sidechain compressor as well. So it happens by default, but you can, if you want, go in and set its attack and release settings and amount. Distortion as well is another effect. It's just plain old clipping. sample rate reduction, which you saw before, but this is how you do it in the menu. Get some quite interesting sounds when that's combined with a synth. And bit crushing. Probably works a little bit better on kick drum kind of sounds than lead synth sounds, but there you go, that's how you get in there and turn it on. And that's all for the effects menu. Bringing us back to sidechain compression, I'll cover that a little bit later. The other thing I'm going to show you in the sound editor is FM synth, so that was all a subtractive synth. I'll make another brand new synthesizer now and just quickly show you some of the FM settings. So this is defaulted back to a basic square wave synth. If I go back into the menu, so as well as subtractive synthesis, the other modes are FM synthesis, and there's a ring mod mode as well, which is still subtractive, but the two oscillators are multiplied together rather than just both being mixed or added together. Anyway, I will show you the FM mode now. So if I get out of there, some new menu options will have appeared. So we get, as well as carrier 1 and 2, which were called oscillator 1 and 2 before, but they're now called carrier 1 and 2. They are the sine wave oscillators that you will hear. There's also modulator 1 and 2, which are the sine wave oscillators that will modulate the frequency of carriers 1 and 2. So for each of those, you can go in, say carrier 1, you can so for each of those, say carrier 1, you can go in, you can transpose it wherever you want. At the moment I think it's being modulated by one default modulator. There's fine scent adjustment option and a volume option. Yes, that's the only carrier that actually exists at the moment, so turn that back up. Carrier 2, again, its volume is turned all the way down at the moment, but I'll turn its volume up. At the moment it's the same frequency as carrier 1, so it sounds just the same, but if we go and transpose it somewhere else, say an octave up, or 2 octaves up, or something more interesting. Go back out of the carriers, go to, say, modulator 1. You can change the amount which it is modulating the carriers. Turn it all the way off. We're now only hearing those 2 carriers, sine waves, playing together. As we start modulating them, it becomes that FM sound. And again, of course, you can change the transpose of that modulator. Modulator 2, at the moment doesn't have any amount, it's switched off, but we can turn that on and start having it additionally modulate the 2 carriers. You can also, for modulator 2, you can choose whether you want its destination to be the carriers, modulating those 2 carriers, or if you instead want it to modulate modulator 1. So we now have we now have modulator 2 modulating modulator 1, which is modulating the 2 carriers. That doesn't sound very nice. Let's see if we can find a better transpose amount for modulator 2. That's a little bit more interesting. So you can spend a lot of hours fine-tuning these and attempting to find some interesting instrument sounds. And much like I showed you patching earlier to control the frequency of a low-pass filter with an envelope, you can do the same for all kinds of different parameters, including, say, the amount of modulator 2. So we're still in the modulator 2 submenu. Go into its amount, press the select knob again, and we can select what thing we want to control that amount. We could use LFO1. could instead use envelope 2. Another thing you might like to do is to manually assign one of these functions that you can access through the menu to the gold knobs over here, so you can get to it more easily later without having to dive into the menu again. This is done very easily. While you're viewing the number for a given parameter, simply hold down Learn and turn a knob. I'm first going to select which sort of function section I want to actually reassign. So it learns for one of the two knobs within a given function section. So select which one you want. I'm going to relearn custom 2 to this, which I think was the transpose for one of the modulators. You press Learn and you just turn the knob that you want to be assigned. So the display indicates Learn to show that it has learnt that knob to that parameter. And if we jump back out of the sound editor, which by the way there's an easy shortcut, if you just press any of the main pads on the sequencer area down here, it jumps you right back out, so you don't have to keep on tapping the back button. It's very easy. Now, anytime we like, we can turn this knob and we change the pitch of modulator 2. You can save your own presets as well, like this one that we just made. If I go back into the sound editor menu, if you press save while you're in the sound editor menu, it saves the preset as opposed to saving the song, which I showed you before. And this is shown to you in case you forget. Once you've pressed save, it flashes the save button and flashes the synth button, saying I'm saving this synth, as opposed to flashing the song button, which you saw before. The synth defaulted when I created it to slot 44, which was a blank synth. So if I press save, it saves it into slot 44. And if I were to go and make some more changes and wanted to save it again next time around, it would default to slot 44A. So you can save all your different variations as you're trying to create that perfect synth sound. Another example of something you might like to do with a custom synth that you can create. I'll make another brand new blank synth. You can go in and instead of a regular oscillator source, like a square wave that we have at the moment, if you set it to sample, go back out, you now have an option to load a sample from the file browser, which you can access through this menu as well. You saw it before with the shortcut for loading a new sample into a kit, but this is making a new synth sound which uses a sample as its sound. It'll be pitched up and down. So if you jump into File, it takes you into the file browser, and we're back in that 808 folder, I think. If we just pick a sound, it loads it. That becomes our oscillator source, and you can use it just like a synth, but it's just that WAV file being pitched up and down. You can apply all the same filters to it and that sort of thing. You might not really want to with this one. It probably wouldn't sound all that good. No, that's not bad. And you can go and make a tune with it. That doesn't sound bad at all. And one last thing I'm going to show you in the sound editor is for trimming audio samples, such as the ones you might record with the microphone. I'm going to start a brand new blank song and blank kit again and record a basic sound. Hello. Hello. So you can hear my sample being played back there, but there is a little bit of additional time at the start, a little bit of lag time before the actual sound starts. Hello. I want to get rid of that so I can play it instantly every time I hit the pad. So if I go into the menu for this given sample, so when you're in kit mode, when you go into the sound editor menu by pressing the select knob, it goes in there for the currently selected sample. At the moment there only is one sample. If there are multiple ones, it'll be whichever one has its audition pad illuminated. So we're now in the sound editor menu for my hello sample. Go into the oscillator 1 menu, submenu, which is where it stores the recorded WAV file that I just made. It stores it under oscillator 1, using it in place of any synth oscillator that might be going on. giving you some additional options which also apply to synths like transpose. You can, I showed you earlier how to repitch the sample using the gold knobs, but you can also change the transpose for it in the menu here.
Hello, 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 hello.
I'll put that back. You can go into the zone option, which is how you trim off the start, if that's what you want to do. So within the zone submenu, there's options for start and end points. Go into start, and you can shift it by a whole number of seconds or milliseconds. I think we want to shift it by less than a second. So I'll go into the millisecond option and just turn that up a little bit.
Hello.
Still a bit of lag time there, so I'll turn it up some more.
Hello.
It's a little bit better.
Hello. Hello.
That's better. It goes up in tens by default, but if I hold it down and shift, you can go switch it, shift it by individual milliseconds. So I think 300 was around about right.
Hello. Hello.
Put it up a little bit more.
Hello. 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 Hello.
Nope, I had it too high.
Hello.
There are some other options. If we jump out of those couple of submenus we went into, as well as zone, you can change the loop type. So at the moment it is set to play the entire thing through once every time you press down.
Hello.
It'll only play it once. You can also change that to repeat, which means for as long as you hold it down,
Hello.
it'll keep on repeating it.
Hello. Hello.
Or you can set it to cut, which means that it will only play for as long as you hold it down.
Hello. Hello. Hello.
Maximum of one time through. You can reverse the sample. Record a brand new one to replace this one if you want, although it'd be easier to do that just with the method I showed you earlier with holding down a pad, an audition pad, and pressing the record button. But this is how you can actually do this for an existing sort of sample if you had some other effects or something applied to it already. Now I've shown you some basic sample drum kits already, but the Deluge is a powerful sequencer that can play and manipulate all kinds of samples, not just limited to drums. Here I've got a kit of a range of different interesting sounds. I'm playing them live on the pads there, but we can sequence them as notes. So I showed you before how to select for a sample whether it plays the entire time through every time you trigger it, or whether it can play for a shorter amount of time then cut out. For ones which are designed to cut out at the end of a note, you can set the length of the sample where it's to play back. So for this bottom one here that I've just put a sort of longish note there for, when we play the sequence, it just plays for the duration of that note. In fact, all the samples in this kit are preset to do that, but other kits are not necessarily. If they have more percussive sounds, you probably want the entire sample to play through the entire time. I'm going to show you a couple more things now. First of all, you can make a long synth note so long that it occupies the entire sequence. That's a special case so that when you play it, it will just continue to drone indefinitely. It won't restart each time you come around. Now I'm going to use that synth drone that I've created as the basis for some sidechaining, which I'm going to show you now. If I just create a kit track to play at the same time as that drone. By default, with the supplied kits, the kick and snare are patched to affect the sidechain. And other tracks, if you go, so we've gone back into our synth track now, sidechain is an option for the gold knobs. If you turn it up, it starts to duck its volume to the kick and snare sounds. In the sound editor menu, you can in fact manually select the attack and release times for the sidechain. It's also tempo synced by default, but you can change that. Sidechain can also be patched to other things besides volume, which can create some really interesting effects. So back in the sound editor now, which I showed you before, if we wanted to say apply the sidechain ducking not to volume but to low pass filter frequency, if we go into frequency, which of course we can change that frequency number, but if we go one level further in, we can select what thing we want to patch to that frequency. Sidechain is one of those options. So if we turn that up, so sidechain now, each kick and snare hit no longer is ducking the volume, it's ducking the low pass filter frequency of the synth sound. Not an effect you hear very often. It can be cool to patch that to the actual pitch of the synth as well. Which you access by going to transpose. Again, patch the sidechain to it. Patch it to volume a little bit as well. And there you go, sidechaining. I'll show you something else as well. If I create a number of notes, another interesting modulation source that you might like to use, say to go to filter frequency, is the random source. So that's just a new random note, a random number which is generated at the start of each voice. And I've got that going to low pass filter frequency now, and that's just a way you can get some nice sort of random variation to your patterns. And let's have another quick look at tempos. And there's also a tap tempo function. The limit for the tempo is actually ridiculously high if you just keep on turning the tempo up. Well, the number just eventually gets too big for the display. It can go extremely slow as well. Down to 1 BPM or considerably less. Showing it as 0, it's not quite 0, it'll be 0 point something. I'm just going to add another synth track so I can show you some more stuff to do with mixing or sort of affecting volume and pan. So with 3 tracks currently going, it's our bass, our drums, and our sort of synth lead there. It's just one big droning note. I showed you earlier on that holding down a pad on a track gives you access to its parameters over here. Of course, one of them is volume, so you can sort of fade parts in and out. Pan as well. So that's with affecting individual tracks while we're in song view by holding one down. There was also that affect entire mode to affect the entire song. So you can pan the entire thing if you want. Some things I didn't show you earlier. The reverb you can add for the whole song. You can also cycle through a couple of different reverb presets. Just large, small, and medium rooms. Modulation effects as well. Switched off by default, but as soon as you start to turn up this one, which is the depth or feedback depending on the modulation type, this is flanger by default. This one becomes the rate. Pressing down on this knob changes the type from flanger to chorus. Let's turn up that rate. Changing this, that's the chorus offset. If we press it again, depth. Pressing this again goes to phaser. It's depth I'm controlling down there, or I can also control feedback. Turning this bottom one all the way down always deactivates the modulation effects.